One, thank you all so much for being here. I'm Nora Benavidez. I work at PEN America, and I am so honored to have all of these wonderful leaders here with me. I am almost intimidated by having all of them, I have to say. And I'm really honored to be here with all of you as audience members and with our co-host, the Dallas Public Library. And so I wanted to make sure that our colleagues were able to say hello and welcome all of you. Can I turn it to Kristen or Heather to say hi?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Kristen from Dallas Public Library. We are so excited to be a part of this panel and, or to be, I guess, hosting. And thank you all so much for being here with us. This is a really important issue to us. It is really near and dear, I think, in Dallas communities. And I'm just so excited to be able to share this information and hear what you all have to say. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Kristen and Heather. This is now the second in a series that we are working on with the Dallas Public Library from PEN America. And I'm really thrilled that this is a conversation that I think is on a much needed topic, that when I've researched and been working in media, misinformation, and with Latinx communities, I feel like we don't have enough of these conversations. And so when we were thinking about what this discussion should be in the lead up to the election and the importance of our Latino, our Latinx, our Spanish language and immigrant populations and how they receive information, frankly, we felt we needed to have this in English and Spanish. And so it became an incredible barrier that I actually never anticipated in trying to find ways to get English and Spanish live for this evening. And so a special shout out to our wonderful live translators, Ernest and Tamber, who are here. You're not seeing them, but they are the magic behind the scenes, because this is, I think, if we're really going to walk the walk and talk about how we get credible news and information to a variety of communities, we have to then provide that in a variety of languages. So thank you to our wonderful translators, and thank you to the Dallas Public Library for bringing us together and for believing in this type of conversation. So I want to, honestly, I want to dive right in. I don't want to waste any time because I have these amazing panelists with me. And I would like to really just introduce them very quickly. And I'll start with James Barragan, who works at the Dallas Morning News. He has covered immigration, public safety, and voting rights, and has traveled on assignment to the US Supreme Court, which I have to say as an attorney is very cool. Traveled to Houston during Hurricane Harvey, equally cool, but terrifying. And before joining the Dallas Morning News in 2017, he worked for the Austin American-Statesman, as well as for the LA Times, for the Los Angeles Times. Next, I want to introduce Stacey Marie Ishmael, who is the editorial director of the Texas Tribune. Stacey Marie, I was reading about you, I was reading about everyone, and something was described when there was an article about you as a digital savvy expert. And so your background today seems to speak to how utterly cool you are with your pink background. But prior to moving to Austin for the Texas Tribune, Stacey Marie was a senior editor at Apple. She was the managing editor for mobile at BuzzFeed News and vice president of communities at the Financial Times. She's also a native of Trinidad, and I like that in your bio you say you are a serial comma enthusiast, Stacey Marie. Next, we have Liz Magallanes, who is from Mi Familia Vota. We are so thrilled to have you, Liz. A native of Ciudad Juarez, Liz came to the United States when she was 7 years old. She grew up everywhere. Growing up, she lived in North Texas, then from Dallas and Richardson. And we're really excited in particular to have Liz, because I think where so much of how we're discussing issues around news and credible news for Latinx populations, we need to then also tee up for people where they can turn when they need election and voter participation information. And so one of the things that's really critical and empowering about Liz is that she believes dignity and respect for people of color, immigrants, and for all people, regardless of race or faith, should ring out in every aspect of our society. And so as we approach this election season in November, I think that is a particularly salient issue for us to elevate. And then finally, we have Nicholas Rios, who is Documented's audience editor. And he is an Emmy-nominated Chilean journalist living in New York City, working as an audience and communities strategist for media companies. And he has experience across Latin America and in Chile with CNN Chile, Vice, BBC. I have to say, I know a lot about Documented's work. And so we're really honored to have you, as we are so honored to have everyone here on this panel. So I want to dive right in because I have a countdown to our election day, which is November 3rd. We are 82 days away from that. Feels like a long time, but I think it's right around the corner. And I feel like all I do now is think about the election and read about the election. But there are a lot of conversations we're not having. And I really am thrilled to bring these people together because I think that a lot of you are thinking about the issues of how you bring credible information to communities that need it. Just a few years ago, to give you a sense, there were only 4 major daily Spanish language papers around the country. That was in the 21st century. And yet we have a population, a Hispanic, Spanish language, Latinx population in the double digits around the country. And so I think about the need for conversations like this that not only open up space for us to talk about access to news for Latinx and Spanish language communities, but also how do we give information to those communities in the lead up to November? We have 82 days. I want to be very practical. And I think that so much right now between the pandemic, between civil unrest and protests happening around the country, democracy is absolutely under threat. Part of what PEN America does is look at these issues and try to work with communities and with media partners. And in the middle of doing that, I want to make sure that we're all talking to the right people, like all of you. So media experts, misinformation experts and reporters, I'm looking at you, James, voting rights and information experts, you know, you're doing amazing work. So I want to start with Nicholas, because when we started thinking about this panel, we felt that there just wasn't enough discussion about how Latinx and Spanish language communities get their information. And so I felt like it was a really powerful place for us to start. Documented has been doing some amazing work. I would say it's really innovative work to provide credible news to immigrant communities. So I'm hoping you can kick us off. Can you tell us a bit about your work and how you serve Latinx and immigrant readers?
Now, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
awesome. Thank you for inviting us, the whole team of Documented and representing. We started as basically as an immigration news media outlet in English, but then we wanted to dive into the Latino communities of New York State in general, not only New York City. So before like thinking, hey, maybe we can like have a new website or have a new Facebook page or like have a new newsletter, because that's the main way that we deliver news in English. We went the opposite. We put audiences first. We basically embedded with local communities, with leaders, with churches, and then we started talking with people, basically showing up and talking to people. After having like maybe 20 talks, we had like a very like maybe 4 basic questions that we wanted to ask, and we were like there as reporters, but at the same time like trying to have a meaningful conversation. We understood some things about like the way that Latino communities in New York consume news. One of them is that privacy was number 1, for example, priority for them, and that the current offering of news outlets in Spanish were not doing enough of the job. And the third, there was a lot of this like they like people here felt that like Univision, El Diario, or Telemundo were covering their issues, but always putting Latinos in two positions, or victims all the time, or like gang members, or like crime, you know. So, and then the third thing that we found out is that people mainly, like Latinos here, mainly, and like not people that necessarily was born here, but people that came here, they mainly would consume their news in Spanish and via WhatsApp, not via emails and not via Facebook. So what we decided to do is to basically meet the audience where they are. So we launched a WhatsApp community that for the first year, it was basically word of mouth. And then after the pandemic hit New York, that it hit New York very badly, what ended up happening is that we started to receive a lot of questions like, if I'm undocumented, can I go get tested? If I get tested, will that information end up with ICE? So what ended up happening is that after a couple of like days, what happened is that we ended up having like a lot of the same questions. So we decided to do like explanation, like these are your rights, or like for healthcare access, or if you're here trapped because your country closed their borders, we can, like, this is how you can extend your tourist visa. So what ended up happening at the end of like a couple of weeks is that we had a massive library of content in pages that we then put in like one single place that we now call like the master resource page of Documented. And the number of people in the community has grown by like 60% since the pandemic started. So we're now closing the circle that, for example, in April, the city of New York announced a donation to them by the OSF, by like George Soros Foundation, so they could redistribute it to local undocumented people affected. So they announced it on Telemundo. I remember nothing personal with Telemundo, but they announced it like on Telemundo and Univision, and they all carried that information. And like I'm a former employee of a TV station, CNN Chile. But what ended up happening is that the TV stations carried the information that the city was gonna deliver money, right? So our members started to ask us like, how do you apply for that money? And I manage personally every single message that goes out to our users. Because of the way that WhatsApp is set up, only the person with physical access to the phone can actually use it. So I did not have the answer, and I started to ask around, and nobody had the answer. So after so many questions about it, I basically tried to contact the city, and nothing happened. And then one of the stations carried the information, and like with a live contact, that they were indeed delivering like prepaid debit cards. And what ended up happening is that there was no way to apply, and our users made questions about it. So we assigned a reporter, because how can this be that there's this program that the city is saying on TV in one of these stations, we are delivering the money, we're showing how we're giving prepaid cards to people, but us who are immigration reporters don't know how to apply, you know? And our investigative reporter found out that there was indeed no way to apply, that the city had selected a selected number of nonprofits to deliver the money in their discretion, that there was no way to check that they were not giving the same money to to the same people in two different organizations, that there was no way to check, for example, that the money was that the money was not given to their relatives or friends. There was basically no accountability, and we found out that thanks to our users. That's, sorry for taking so long, but that's basically what we do. We create content from our users that are all Latinos, Spanish-speaking, mainly undocumented.
That's so great, Nicholas. And I think it's necessary to talk about some of those details, even if it takes a while, because it seems to be such a good example of how you are built by and for communities and meeting them where they are. which I don't think we do enough of with our communities, and which ones get left out in media. So often it is more marginalized groups, Black, Indigenous, other people of color. I think that, you know, when I heard about the model that Documented had been built on, it seemed like a really powerful way of making sure that communities get what they need. And by having that, the loop that you describe, it's really powerful to hear in action. And I know that there are, even here on our panel, other examples of ways that you all are thinking about how to get credible information to communities. And so Stacey Marie, you know, I want to turn to you. You are the editorial director at the Texas Tribune. And I've heard you talk before about some of these issues. I know you actually started in March though, which is so ironic in the middle of the pandemic. But you know, in that short time though, you've still been very active and outspoken about needing to get information to communities. And I know that the Texas Tribune has a partnership with ProPublica actually to translate reporting into Spanish. And I think part of that is because you're aware of gaps, but can you tell us more?
Yeah, I mean, the partnership it's an investigative reporting partnership. And one of the things we do with that reporting is translates into Spanish, but it's a partnership that was designed to combine the expertise and like deep insider knowledge that the Texas Tribune newsroom has of the state with the sort of incredible investigative firepower that a media organization like ProPublica has. And ProPublica has for a while been committed to, you know, translating various different types of coverage into, you know, the languages of the communities that are both most affected by that reporting and to whom it's most important, which isn't always the same. One of the things that I am really happy to see us do more of is start to think from the perspective of the Tribune newsroom itself. How can we also take some of our reporting and either translate the existing reporting that we're doing or actually invest in dedicated reporters who can make those media appearances, be on the WhatsApp groups, to your point, Nicolas, and, you know, really part of the community in a way that's not what happens in a lot of newsrooms, which is like you happen to have a bilingual reporter and then you sort of tap on their shoulder every time you need something, but it's like an add-on to their beat as opposed to like a dedicated point of focus and something that you're really invested in resources into. So we're tackling this from two directions, right? We're actively looking at ways to fund a dedicated Spanish language reporter with this precise focus on, you know, coronavirus misinformation, the elections, democracy, capital D, and, you know, certainly the general election in November. And of course, we are also paying a lot of attention to the news that's happening with the census.
Can you tell us a little more about some of those concerns that you're seeing?
Where does one begin? I think for me, I've been studying and reporting on misinformation for what is now a long time. And one of the biggest underreported areas of misinformation has always been medical, right? I mean, I think people are familiar with the phenomenon around vaccinations, and I don't think people really understand how big a part of the internet, you know, like vaccine misinformation really is. And so when the pandemic hit, the misinformation armies that had been, you know, really involved in vaccine misinformation for a long time, like turned their attention to this other thing. And I think we were really focused, we, the media, have been hyper-focused on this idea of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda as being like outside actors. You know, people will talk about the Russians, they will talk about the Chinese government, but there's a lot of US-based, homegrown stuff that is showing up on Facebook, in WhatsApp groups. WhatsApp groups are like notorious hubs for these kinds of things that are targeting people who are vulnerable with everything from, oh, actually they move the date that you vote to, you can cure coronavirus if you drink this particular oil. And so where I am really focusing our efforts is we have an amazing team of reporters who know the ins and outs of health and public health and are reporting on those stories every single day. We have amazing reporters doing important work on the census and voting rights and the fact that there is, for example, no difference between an absentee ballot and a mail-in ballot, like in practice. And my commitment to, my newsroom is we are going to figure out all the ways possible to make sure that information reaches the communities that are being targeted by misinformation and disinformation around these subjects.
Well, that's great to hear. One of the things that PEN America does is trainings with voters and trainings with people who are not in media to learn how to identify what misinformation is, what the difference is, for example, between mis and disinformation. And I think that, people often feel it is an abstract concept, that there are Russians and there trolls, they kind of don't quite understand in practice what it looks like. And that there are ways that narratives here in this country are promoted, and there are ways that narratives are manipulated that lead to voter suppression, that lead to people thinking, oh, if I wear a mask, the coronavirus will get activated in my mouth. That is something that was promoted in this misinformation documentary called Plandemic. And so there are so many ways that I think we're seeing that it isn't just far away from us, but that the deluge of information, whether it's about the pandemic and misleading information that, in that context, to what's happening with the election, it's everywhere. And I know, one of the things when we were preparing for this panel, James and I spoke a little bit about this and the ways that this uniquely targets Latino and Spanish language communities. And I know that, James, you mentioned some of your experience with your own family, and certainly through your work in reporting at the Dallas Morning News. You work at a very important nexus between voting rights, immigration, and politics. And so I'm wondering if you could kind of tell us a little bit, based on your work and reporting, how you see these issues affecting the communities that we're talking about tonight.
Yeah, so I think a little bit of what we're talking about here, whether it's Nicolas talking about his WhatsApp group and how that helps inform his community, or Stacey Marie talking about how WhatsApp is notoriously bad at spreading disinformation. We're talking a lot about the disruption of news, media. Right? Yeah, of media. And it happens on WhatsApp, it happens on Facebook, and the traditional outlets where that used to dominate what we used to call the voice of God, news narration to the masses, which was TV, print, and radio, they are becoming less and less important. And we're seeing the rise of digital, and we're seeing the rise of a lot of messaging apps and social network platforms, which has tremendous advantages, as Nicolas has talked about, but also Stacey Marie talks about the disadvantages of it. There is no regulation in a lot of those areas. And so you are able to see the spread of mis and disinformation on WhatsApp groups. We've seen terrible atrocities spread through WhatsApp in India, in Burma. There's just been tremendous atrocities that have happened because of the misinformation that's been spread. And so for me, on a personal note, it's been interesting to watch this because I grew up in a Latino household. My mom was an avid news watcher. We used to have Univision and Telemundo turned on all the time. We would watch Jorge Ramos, Pedro Zepsek, all of them every day. And we just loved the news. That's part of why I went into journalism. But lately what's happened with my mother, and it's been interesting to watch, is that with Trump and with the anti-immigrant rhetoric, she's just completely turned off the television because she is turned off by the barrage of the constant flow of Trump anti-immigrant rhetoric. And it's difficult to deal with that because on the one hand, we have to report the news, but people do get tired and there is a certain fatigue. But the other thing that's happened with her is that she's turned a lot to Facebook, which is what happens with a lot of people. And they're looking for the good things that social networks bring us, like camaraderie and friendship and being able to connect with other people in the world. But the other thing that happens is that there's a spread of misinformation. And so she'll send me And there's some things that are innocuous and kind of silly, where she'll send me a YouTube video and say, look, it's an angel. And it's a clearly edited video. And I say, Mom, that's, it's a clearly edited video. But other things that happen, like on Facebook, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was, and this comes from the president's rhetoric as well, but it gets spread out to what Stacey Marie is talking about in terms of the homegrown and foreign actors who are spreading misinformation. My mom started talking to me about, I think they've created this virus in a lab. And I had to talk her down and say, Mom, there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence from scientists that that's the fact. And where are you getting this information from? And it turned out that she was hearing these things on the social networks. And so I think that's one of the big issues. And I think there's no easy fix right now. Kind of Pandora's box has been opened and there's no way to really bring it in. But what I always advocate for is that, government has to get involved in one way or another, right? To bring some type of regulation of these things that have gotten way out of hand. The problem with that is that it's not in their interest, right? It's not in their interest to do it. And that goes back to the other thing that we've been talking about, which is the Latino community, right? And how do we engage them? For newsrooms, it's always been about meeting people where they're at. For me, as a newspaper reporter, it's maybe 50-50 whether we're meeting people where they're at through a print newspaper. Immigrant Latinos especially really mostly listen to the radio or to television, low-income immigrants. My experiences with Mexican immigrants, so I think that's mostly how they had gotten their news. And so it's 50-50 how successful we're being at getting to them. And then the other problem, of course, is the investment. And how much are we investing as newsrooms in the Latino community? You could look at our sister paper, Al Día Dallas, and see the size of the newsroom staff now, which I think is 5 or 6 people from where we were 10 years ago. And it's dwindled because of the financial situation with the industry. But then also from elected officials. I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I'll just share that, when we talk about elections and making sure that Latinos, Spanish-speaking Latinos get out to vote, there's a big responsibility on that is on the elected officials like the Secretary of State and the governor and all the state government officials that run that stuff to get on Spanish-speaking media and have these conversations with the people and meet them where they're at. That right now is not happening. We wrote a story about how Univision Dallas-Fort Worth, which is the second or third biggest TV market in Texas, tried for months since April to get an interview with Governor Abbott and were unable to until they finally got some pressure from other outlets. And so that's another thing that we can talk about a little bit more, but that plays into it as well.
One of the things that I find so dangerous about election-related misinformation is it requires a two-step process. Normally if we see things and we get to a point where we can identify that something is misleading, we can then ignore it, right? It's like, I get that the video has been manipulated, I'll ignore it. It might take a long time to get us there and to get people to understanding how they recognize when information is dangerous, is misleading, is disinformation. But with election-related content, in order to get people to vote, they need to go through another step of confirming what the accurate information is. And it's part of why I think it's so dangerous that in the lead up to the election, we're not having more conversations about how we get information in the hands of certain voters, especially as all of you have already said, working in media, we know what the uphill battles are when it comes to the Latino community, when it comes to Spanish-speaking and immigrant groups. And so, Liz, I want to ask you how you are working on your voter participation programming, because getting information, credible information in the hands of voters and working with them. I know you're doing your citizenship workshops, you do your voter registration work. All of that is in furtherance of ultimately getting people to the ballot box. And that's the thing that I think we actually do all want. We want people to be able to exercise those core constitutional rights. And so I'm curious, Liz, if you could tell us what you're doing and how you're getting information to voters?
Yeah, so I think we've got a great opportunity, challenge and opportunity, right? Like being digital, we've been able to come together as like a Texas team. So we're, Mi Familia Vota, we're a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we work primarily in the 6 majority Latino states. So Florida, Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, and Texas. And so we do a lot of work, and obviously like the first step is just having fully bilingual information, right? Having those graphics, having that that digestible and like information online on our social media platforms, on Facebook, right, where our folks are at, and meeting them where they're at and providing that information in their language. The other part is absolutely they are watching, right? They're watching TV. A lot of our immigrant communities, a lot of our naturalized citizens are watching TV, like they're watching the Univisions and Telemundos of the world. And so insofar as those relationships, right, with those Spanish media partners are crucial, they are crucial, right? And in spreading that information about like when elections are, right? Right now, the biggest challenge that we have being in the state of Texas is registering people to vote, because unlike some of our other sister states, we do not have online voter registration in the state of Texas, right? We have those fun extra steps that we have to do, right? We have to mail people their voter registration application, make sure that they fill it out, then follow up and make sure that they've gotten their voter registration card in the mail. And so the way that we've done it is this really exciting voter registration hotline that we've launched nationally. People call 833-VOTAMOS. We've partnered with Univision and with other Spanish language media partners to really spread that information across the country. And really the majority of the calls are coming in from Texas, right? Texans are like Spanish speaking Texans are very hungry for that information, right? For how do I get registered to vote? How do I vote by mail, right? Like what's the difference between these absentee ballots and like voting by mail and all these different things? And so answering those questions in their language, obviously them hearing from people, right, who are just like them, who are, you know, a lot of the folks who we serve, who are serving our community are Latinos, right, are speak their language. And so, and many of us, right, live in these communities. A lot of us are immigrants. So really understanding that the context from where folks are coming from, and understanding the broader, right, the broader stakes, and the stakes couldn't be higher, right? In a year like 2020, when we have the census, right, which is presented, you know, a lot of the pandemic has shown us a lot of challenges, many of which have been, you know, we've confronted with the census and now with the election, but really working with the Latino community and really spreading that information around that voter registration hotline, and really targeting especially a state like Texas, where we face a lot of the challenges that you all mentioned before, along with the things around like voter ID laws and some other barriers that if folks, right, folks who have recently been naturalized, we saw, right, challenges with you know, the purging of voter rolls and things like this, right? And so folks understanding their rights, having that information in Spanish, and also like promoting the fact that folks can be bilingual poll workers, right? Like that's a great need. Having young and bilingual poll workers, right, is going to be super crucial in this election as well.
One of the #1 things I used to see when I was a litigator was poll workers not aware that Spanish language voters can bring a translator into the ballot box with them. And that was one of the biggest barriers on election day to allowing Spanish language voters to cast their vote. And it was, I wouldn't go so far as to say it was misinformation, but it was people being ill-informed. And so I'm really excited to hear about some of those ways that you're trying to really connect people and meet them where they are on those information needs. You know, I want to talk about mail-in ballots, and I want to hear from all of you about what you guys are hearing in the emails, the messages on Twitter that you get. I have messaged Stacey Marie too many times already on Twitter. You know, what are the things that you are hearing and you're most concerned about regarding specifically these Spanish language communities?
This is very, very large like number of things that I'm concerned about. I do think the biggest one are the sometimes veiled, sometimes explicit suggestions that are just slightly wrong, but wrong enough to send people to the wrong place, right? Oh, your polling station moved, or it's only open from, you know, like 8 to noon, or it's just like the kinds of information that seems plausible on its face, and that unless you are incredibly paranoid or have sort of a well-developed suspicion of all authority, especially if it's coming from your friends, that's really challenging. And so I want to go back to something that we talked about earlier, which is you can't regulate your family. And in a lot of circumstances, family members, people you trust, celebrities that you look up to are actually the biggest sources of unreliable information in terms of like your peer group, right? So the other thing that I often say is this isn't a new problem. Like voter suppression, not a new problem. Misinformation, not a new problem. I've been on the internet long enough to remember when people were forwarding emails saying that if you use a certain kind of deodorant, you'd immediately die of cancer. And so, you know, everything is a lot faster now, and everything gets, you know, it's not just the limit of your Hotmail inbox, it's like anybody that can see your Facebook post. And so when we're thinking about how to tackle this, my number one thing that I think about often is you're not really counteracting the information if you're not rebuilding the trust of the person that you're trying to reach, right? And that's why the point about being in the community is so important. It's if I yell at my mother, not advisable on a good day, and try to tell her that her best friend is an unreliable narrator, like that's not going to end well for me, and it's not going to achieve the goal of, you know, helping her understand that, you know, this thing that she's being emailed is not reliable. I have to bring her with me. I have to be not condescending. I have to be understanding and empathetic. And that's true for my family, but it's also true for the news, right? Because the things that are reaching people and the misinformation that's really effective is happening because it's being delivered by folks that people trust in accessible formats, to Liz's point, right? Like they're memes, they're clever, they're sort of up to the moment, they're well designed. And what do media organizations do? We like print a 1,000-word story that doesn't have any of those attributes. So we're sort of fighting the battle at a disadvantage unless we're really willing to change our tactics.
What else are you guys seeing? Nicholas, I know you've been doing work on specifically around WhatsApp as a platform and as a platform where misinformation can thrive. And so what are the things that you're hearing from communities?
Yes, well, like linking back to what Stacey was doing or was saying, I think that, yes, we are at disadvantage because how you compete, right? So we've been trying to do something like that because we are in the medium where Latinos are and in the medium where fake news thrive. So for example, what we've been trying to do is try to mimic what the fake news are doing. So for example, if we have like, if we publish something like about like, hey, how can you get like food in New York? Mm-hmm. We would create an audio version of our messages. So people and like with like encouraging people to like forward it. Or we are now trying like partnering with Latino illustrators so they can like create illustrations. So like we basically transform our journalism into illustrations that are then like easier to like shared, you know. Yeah, it is working, and like people say, hey, like I sent this to my family, or like for example with the story about the donation from the OSF to the city, we ended up having like a lot of new subscribers because and people like from organizations like nonprofits were saying that their members were talking about it without us knowing, you know. So I guess that when like if you try to mimic, you can try to do it. It's difficult because fake news is also are also like what people might want to hear instead of like the truth that is not necessarily that. So far, and I'm going back to your original question, Nora, we haven't really heard things about the election because at least here in New York, the Latino community is still struggling with money and food. So most of the comments that we get still like, how can I get money? How can I get a job? How can I get food to eat? So far, the election is not that present. The census is still, it's a little bit coming up, but so far it's all about like survival.
Well, to Nicolas's point, I mean, it is, you know, so far we're not hearing about the election from the Latino community so much, right? I'm right now working on a story about mail ballots here in Texas. And let me tell you, it's a hot mess. And elections in Texas are confusing to begin with. And to Stacey Marie's point, I mean, there is some stuff that is misinformation, and it's a question of whether it's intentional or not. But there are situations that are kind of also the perfect storm. So one example is that a lot of counties here in Texas have moved from having multiple election polling locations to having centralized election centers. And so by doing that, you actually do reduce the number of polling locations that there are in your county, but they also allow for the convenience of, okay, you don't have the convenience of in any other year that wasn't a pandemic, you don't have to drive back home after work to vote at your polling location, because you can do it while you're on your way to work or during lunchtime at the election center close to your job, or when you're picking up your kid from school, right? So in any other year, that would have been super helpful, and there should have been a lot more information about that. But now we're dealing with coronavirus all the time. The other thing with mail ballots is that we expect them to be much more used this time around than they were or have been in other elections. The problem that we're seeing now is that there were a lot of hiccups during the July 14th primary runoffs here in Texas. Some of that is user error. Some of that seems to be errors at the post office or with your county elections administrators, but we need to get to the bottom of that. But here's the situation. I mean, I am interviewing people who are precinct chairs, election judges, election clerks, very experienced people when it comes to voting, and they are having trouble figuring out how mail balloting works. Yep. So if these very highly educated people who are highly educated about the voting system in Texas are having trouble understanding it, then what is the Spanish-speaking Latino community, how are they expected to figure this thing out, right? And it goes back to the thing that I was saying earlier. Our elected officials need to get out here and speak to our people about how they can exercise their fundamental right. They are not doing that. And the other thing is that we need to simplify how to vote in Texas. We talked about there not being online voter registration. In the 21st century, in the middle of a pandemic, that is ridiculous. And the only way that can be changed is through people voting and making their voice heard. So elected officials need to get out and educate their people, and need to realize that Latinos and Spanish-speaking Latinos make up a large part of the Texas population, and they're just as important as other populations. And two, we got to make it happen. We've got to figure out a way. And I totally agree with Stacey Marie in that sometimes I feel like I'm wringing my hands at the media. I'm part of it, but sometimes I feel like, Mookie at the end of Do the Right Thing, where I'm just like throwing the trash can into Salvatore's restaurant, because it just drives me crazy. You know, we're not doing enough, and we need to be part of that change.
Well, and that's so great from all of you, because I think about how even a conversation like this can be performative. Who are we reaching with this? But I'm hoping that it is sort of the beginning of reaching the accountability, James, that you bring up, which is how can we be more accountable to communities and be doing a better job? And it makes me think a little bit about that, the process that you all described of, I think, really trust in how we look to different people. And that usually we look to friends, we look to family, we look to people we like, whether it's celebrities or people that somehow we have this sense of, I don't even know what it is. It's the thing that they have been vetted in our own hearts and minds. And usually it's almost more emotional than it is intellectual. But we then believe people. And in India, for example, part of what was dangerous about the misinformation on WhatsApp groups was that it infiltrated communities in small numbers. So if we were all in this discussion, for example, in a chat, and slowly more people got added in, we still implicitly trusted the group of people. Even if someone was new, we were already friends and colleagues. And so as we're talking, we're not on guard in a way. And the ways that then this happens through Facebook groups, through the channels that we just don't naturally think of thinking critically about, we're now having to face that. And it's a trust issue, I think, actually.
Well, it's a human psychology issue.
Yeah.
And, you know, if my friends are always like, how do I know? And the thing that I always say to them is like, the stronger your emotional reaction, the more likely it is that you're being manipulated, especially if you really, really agree with
we
with
say that
whatever
every
your
time in
claim
our
is.
training, Stacey Marie.
Yeah, like they're like, should I check links? Like, what do I do? I'm like, doesn't matter. Just like, how do you feel? And if you feel very strongly, you are probably being manipulated in some way. And it might be a way that you like, but you're still being manipulated.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, that's hard for newsrooms because we're afraid of emotions. We pride ourselves on this notion of the impartial observer, like just the facts, ma'am, kind of thing. And the people who are interested in undermining the tenets of democracy that we also rely on as the press are very good at weaponizing emotions. And so our, you know, dislike of using a meme to convey information means we've ceded that territory to the people who are gonna use the meme for evil very, very effectively.
Yeah, and if I can say something to that effect, I mean, maybe I'll catch a lot of shtick for saying that, like, us not having online voter registration is ridiculous here in Texas. But I mean, it's the 21st century and we should be able to do that. And there are concerns about potential fraud or whatever those concerns may be, but those things can be addressed. And we're just kind of stopping and saying, well, voter fraud, right? And that's the excuse that always gets thrown around: voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. But there are real ways, and it's difficult sometimes, but there are real ways to address this. And we just stop at it. And to address somebody in the chat, talking about how sometimes the elected officials are just pushing their partisan viewpoints, and that's true. And I think readers see it. I think everybody sees it. So I think, to Stacey Marie's point, we do readers and our audiences a disservice when we don't point that out boldly. And it's something that I struggle with, and maybe Stacey, because I know you're from Trinidad and Tobago, but maybe you have a different viewpoint on it, because I grew up mostly Mexican, just growing up in the United States, but the Latin American press is much more adversarial with their governments. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a different thing. But we here in the United States are so timid about speaking truth to power, and it's so weird to see it, because that's the whole point of our job, and that does feed right into what they are trying to do, which is discredit the arbiters and discredit the people who can sort of have a say and say, yes, this is right, and no, this is wrong.
Before I was a journalist in the US, I was a journalist in the UK, which is incredibly combative. With, you know, adversarial is the right word in a lot of ways, and also not afraid to be like campaigning in a sense, so to bring your audience along with what you believe. And I was talking to Claire Waddle, who's the executive director at First Draft, which does phenomenal work on misinformation, about that exact tension that you're describing, where the US press, and right now we're being actively portrayed as enemies of the people, which is also unhelpful. But, you know, the US press has sort of taken a position that anything that looks too much like an opinion is activism, even when that opinion happens to be a mere recitation of fact, as it were. And I do think that is a challenge.
Well, Liz, I want to hear about how you're thinking about trust. And, you know, so much of this, why I was so excited, frankly, to have you here tonight, is because if we're going, I said it at the beginning, but if we're really going to kind of walk the walk, I think we can't just have media experts talking to media experts, talking to misinformation experts. We have to have people who are also then closing the loop and working on voter participation. And some of that is going to be on election day and in the lead up to it. So, you know, what are your sort of thoughts and reactions to this question of trust and where people turn?
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree that like we turn to like, especially Latinos, but I think like a lot of this is common in a lot of immigrant communities, a lot of communities of color is like we turn to our friends, we turn to our family members, and oftentimes the things that they believe and the things that they're talking about, right? That's what we're gonna go with. So that can be very helpful in terms of like creating, right? We talk about building the next generation of the electorate with our youth leadership programs, right? And informing high school students, right, about why they should get their parents and their grandparents, right? And it's sometimes the other way around. Sometimes it's like the grandparent who just was naturalized or something is getting like the young, like the high school students to vote, or their college age, loved ones to vote. And so I think a lot of it is to what James was talking about, is like sometimes when elected officials are either dodge, right, or ignore, at best ignore, at worst dodge, Spanish language media and further, right, organizations like ours, where we're trying to bring elected officials into the fold so that they can then hear from Latinos, from immigrant communities, right, to come, right, in this scenario, right, it would be virtual, but in another era, right, bringing them in and really having them listen, right, instead of the other way around, which is something that's very important, right? Them hearing from immigrant communities, from Latino communities about the things that they care about, right? Talking about COVID, right? Those numbers are hard numbers, right? And the communities, the zip codes that are getting hit, right, are communities of color, especially in a city like Dallas, cities like Houston, right? So I think where we come in as Mi Familia Vota is making sure that we're bridging that gap, right? So that communities are not only getting the information that they need about, county-wide polling locations, about how to vote by mail, about how, what to bring to the polls and those kinds of things, but really even just like what's going to be on the ballot, right? Like having your ballot, knowing that the ballot is also going to be in Spanish, like all of those kinds of things so that folks can feel that sense of safety, so that leading up to that, they feel that confidence from the time they're being registered to vote, right, with us, and to the time they get to go to the polls, right? Little things like knowing exactly what to take to the polls and those kinds of things. And really that trust comes from being there, right? From them seeing us at schools and faith communities and being in the community and talking about these things and addressing these things head on. Things around the census and questions about confidentiality, right? All those concerns are also true for citizens even, right? Those of us who grew up in immigrant communities, like understand that and in communities of color, right? Like there is an inherent distrust for justified distrust, right? But making sure that we're using that same system, right? To like what you all were saying is to make sure that we're getting those things that are rightfully ours, right? In terms of having that accountability with elected officials, and creating those opportunities, not just for the people that are always, like the usual suspects, the people that are gonna vote regardless, but really, I mean, we have seen an uptick and we have seen an increase in interest, not just from North Texas but also from like border communities in the Valley, in El Paso, right? Folks who who have seen things in El Paso, of course, but also in the Valley, that are experiencing and living and breathing these realities that have been so because of elections, right? There are consequences to elections, and there are also benefits that come from them. And so looking at who is benefiting, right? And it's more often than not our communities, right? So what do we do about that? And we've seen an incredible energizing around obviously this moment of racial reckoning in which we're living, but also around immigrant rights and the interests of our communities to see that justice and to see that really prevail.
Yes, Nicholas.
Can I say something? We are also gonna create some content for Spanish speakers about the presidential election, but we want to recreate what we did for the pandemic, especially with the fake news. Now that we're talking about it, what happened is that so you see, we don't have anything against like big media. We partner with Univision. Because it's important. They have like a huge reach, Univision, Telemundo, El Diario. So it's impressive, the reach. Like our moms keep reading the newspapers, keep watching the TV. But at the same time, our initial research said that they still felt them distant. So we partnered with Univision for a fake news effort, and we sent a call out to our community that has thousands of members on WhatsApp. And what ended up happening is that we found out that the fake news among the Latinos here in New York were quite different than the fake news that, for example, were being published by the New York Times. So while the New York Times was talking about 5G, for example, we did not get on like even one submission or like comment from our users about 5G, for example. It was like quite different things. Right. For example, we were thinking like, and it had to do the fake news regarding the pandemic more with like cures, like natural cures, you know, like drink this so you're gonna be cured, or like, you know, or like, so that effort of like going through the audiences first helped us create one of the best performing articles in the year. Even now, people search a lot and go to that article because basically it speaks the same language, you know. Had we not gone through the audiences first, we journalists from our position, we could have maybe ended up reporting and trying to like debunk the 5G only in Spanish. It's the same, right? Yeah. And for example, the resource guide now is by far the best performing product of documented in the year. And that is because it meets a certain need that exists. So we want to do the same for presidentials, because for presidential content, because we might we are journalists here, we are educated, we have access to internet, we have a salary, or at least we have had education. So what we think is missing, what we think we should report on, is a quite different thing that maybe other people that are not in our position need. So I mean, I just wanted to flag that was like very interesting for us about the fake news for Univision, because that let us like understand all the fake news that were going around. So that was like, it was about cures, and it was about like money, you know, like scams like in Facebook, on WhatsApp, like click here and you will get like $1,000, and like using Latino celebrities. They were using like Dr. Apollo, you know, and like click here, and we followed through, and at the end of the day they were like requesting like a credit card. But if we had not gone through the audiences, those links would have never reached us.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I'm glad we're having this conversation now. We are going to keep this on our websites and on YouTube through Election Day and through the weeks that follow in November. Because, you know, if I'm thinking about this and I'm worried, I think there are a lot of people that are not thinking about these issues. And Nicholas, to your point, figuring out what issues will matter to communities, we need to understand what those are. And for the election in particular, I talk to experts all the time on misinformation, and people say, well, we need to be ready for a discrediting of our democratic institutions by our current president. We need to be ready for very sophisticated arguments. And I often think that we are going to see other types of mis and disinformation that reporters, I hope, will report on and talk about, because those are the stories that a lot of communities are going to need information about. And so I'm looking at time. I want to make sure I open it up for some questions soon, but I have one main question. It is my number one question for all of you, which is, how are you going to give credible information to your constituents?
I can start. I mean, I think the number one thing that we're trying to do is be where people are, right? Whether that's from a language perspective, from a format perspective, we're going to do, you know, if it's audio, if it's events, if it's using photography and visual storytelling better and differently, so we're more shareable on the platforms that people are gathering. That's really important to me. And like, just report the hell out of everything, right? Like the baseline for us, yeah, it's like the baseline for us is there are well-oiled highly motivated armies of people out there every day trying to give people wrong information about X, Y, and Z. I don't have the same size of army, but we are also highly motivated to provide, accurate, factual, reliable, nonpartisan information to help people make better decisions.
Yeah, I got a ton of ideas just from being on this panel and hearing the experiences of everybody else on this panel. But yeah, I mean, I think just meeting people where they are. I think the idea of, I saw a couple of people in the chat room and people on the panel talking about this, but just explaining perhaps in Spanish, maybe doing the Q&A about how do you apply for an absentee ballot and how does that work, and maybe we can do a graphic with it, just kind of, it got my juices flowing in terms, because it is an option that people do have and a lot of our community does have, and so they should have access to that same information. So I'm still devising how, but you guys got my ideas flowing. Yeah.
We here at Documented have decided that we cannot compete with the big media companies on being timely, breaking the news. So what we do in English is an aggregation service of news related to immigration. And in Spanish, what we do is basically create content based on our community. And we are gonna be doubling down on that. As I just said, run subjects through our community to see what happens. Sometimes we get no responses and we say, that we were super interested in doing that, but maybe people are not that interested. And we will be basically creating content from our audience as we do now. 100% of our content in Spanish is run through our community, 100%. So we will keep doing that. And hopefully also maybe we do a lot of collaborations and hopefully collaborating with all my colleagues here. I'm pretty sure that you guys, and we all have content that could be useful for other communities, even though are in different states. So if somebody created another article, maybe that we could carry, that maybe that we could quote, that would be an amazing resource to have.
Yeah.
Just want to note that all Tribune articles are republishable by anyone. So
yeah,
go for it.
I was going to say, as one of what we're going to do is we're going to continue to use the Texas Tribune and the Dallas Morning News as sources and as ways to spread information. But also, they really are a key when it comes to state races, when it comes to the more local elections, and really bringing, what we're going to do as Mi Familia Vota is bring attention to those more local races, right? The spotlight's going to be at the national level as it should be, but really looking at what is who is the person that's going to impact the funding that goes to your child's school, right? Along with completing the census, that school board trustee, that state representative, right? Those city council members, when talking about issues around policing, right? And immigration, all of those folks, right? At the local level are making those decisions. And so we're going to continue to spread that information, bilingual information, and meeting people where they're at and bringing the candidates into our communities and having them hear from Latinos.
That's great. Some of the reporting I've seen so far that's been really wonderful is from my partners that are now working on these issues, like First Draft. They have fellows around the country that I've been working with the American Press Institute. I know the Center for Community Media is here. They're an amazing partner. The good news, frankly, is that I think there are a lot of groups that are wanting to help minimize the noise and the disinformation that is flooding our feeds, and hoping to help media partners like all of you with making the right decisions. Because I think in the next few months, 82 days, there are going to be these tough calls where standards desk editors, where community groups and outlets that are thinking about what do we elevate and then what do we decide not to report on, those are going to be the questions that will really be critical in those days. And so I'm so thrilled that you all joined us. And as PEN America is creating more, I would love to share it with our panelists. I would love to share it with everyone here who has been a partner and an audience member. We're working a lot on how to talk to family members and friends, to the points that all of you echoed throughout tonight of how you build empathy in correcting people. and how to not shame others, because we are in a toxic and caustic environment right now. And so headlines that are accurate, I'm thrilled to see how all of you are doing that. And I just want to thank you before I open it up for questions. Now, we have a Q&A function. If you see at your bottom panel, directory. So the Q&A function is a great place. If you have questions, we have about 15, 20 minutes. So I want to open it up. All of our panelists can see the questions, and unless it's directed explicitly at someone, I want to read it so that everyone can hear this. And then I would like for everyone to be able to jump in as you see fit. So someone asked, how effective do you guys think Trump's strategies for targeting the Latinx community have been? He met recently with Mexican President Obrador, and he also has been praising Goya foods and reporting that he has less deportation than Obama, Biden, period. How is the Latinx community viewing these actions? Are they effective?
I can start off if you want. I don't think it's being very effective. I think obviously that there's going to be a portion of the Latino community, I guess to start off, which is not going to be any news to anybody on this panel, but the Latino community is not a monolith, right? And so obviously there are going to be some people, particularly here in Texas, there's a strong group of people, particularly in South Texas, that are very conservative, who are on the issue of abortion, are very strict. And so they will gravitate towards some of the policies that he's taken and some of the federal judges that he's appointed. There are also people who are business oriented, pro-business, and will like some of the policies that he's taken on that. But I think by and large, if you look at the polling and the surveying of the Hispanic or Latino community, I think it's hard to say that he is making any inroads. And I think people have seen for 4 years what the president thinks of Latinos and what he will do to Latino communities. And, these things like praising Goya foods for their response to the coronavirus pandemic, these things like meeting with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, they are what the president does. He's a showman, he's a marketer. He likes to have these things to boost himself. And sure, they may have some impact on a small few people, but I think for the large part, this is a president who's deeply unpopular with the Latino community, while again, there are some Latinos who do gravitate towards his policies.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we need to give credit, right? Our communities have been living in, right, as Nicolas and all of you report, right, is our communities have seen and felt, right, the reality of this presidency, which has been incredibly detrimental to our communities, whether it's immigrants, whether it's our children, right, whether it's everything when it comes to discriminatory anything really, and looking at the reality, right? I think our community can see pandering, like James mentioned, we are not a monolith, but it's clear, right, that from the beginning, I mean, when you're campaigning on something that is foundational to your platform, pitting people against one another, pitting communities against one another, speaking in a detrimental way about immigrants, about Mexicans, really about Latinos in general, right, and immigrants as a whole, and people of color. I think our communities see past that, and the reality of the pain and suffering that has come. It's also had this effect of empowering, right, and seeing that really our community can make a difference and will make a difference, right? Young people will come out to vote. Latinos and communities of color will come out to vote in November, and we're really going to see that. We saw that in the primary runoff elections. We're going to see that again in the general election in November.
I'm looking at the Q&A for us all now. It seems like there aren't any other questions. There is something about Spanish language newspaper and why it isn't in New Mexico. I'm not quite sure what the audience member meant by that question.
There was a comment about Stacey Marie's background that one of the users was loving it. So am I.
I'll put the link in the chat.
Oh, that's great. Well, that's, I want to make sure, I want to give you all a final opportunity to just, if you want to make any closing remarks, we have a little bit of time, and then I will close us out.
I think the one thing that I would say, or one of the things that I would say is it can feel that like media is also a monolith, but we are ourselves like a very different set of organizations. Like I have incredible respect for the work of my colleagues, and we approach the world, and there's similarities and there's differences. And one of the key things that's really important is like, tell us when we get things wrong. Ideally tell us when we get things right, but definitely tell us when we get things wrong, because like those feedback mechanisms are so important. And I know for a fact, like we're not able necessarily to reply to every single email that we get, but we do read every single one, and they do inform the discussions that we're having in the newsroom. And so if you're a person who's like, oh, it doesn't matter, nobody cares, like we actually do care, and we're trying really hard to be even more receptive and even more attentive to the feedback and concerns of the Texans that we serve.
Yeah, I'll echo that sentiment, and I guess I just got to clear up that I did not yell at my mom when she was looking at the Misinformation videos.
I didn't think you did.
I just got to clarify that. But no, to Stacey Marie's point, I mean, Stacey Marie probably gets a lot more email because she's the editorial director, but I actually do respond to every single email that people send me, and to a great point for this conversation, sometimes it's like just very crazy sounding, angry people with strange email names, nicknames, and they are upset about one thing or another in the story. And then I walk them through it, and I've got a lot of repeat email senders, and we're friends, I would say. They support the newspaper, they like it, they feel comfortable bringing issues to me. But I mean, especially to our Spanish-speaking audience, we at the Dallas Morning News, we need to hear from you guys. And hopefully there's some of my colleagues from Al Dia on this conversation. They do amazing work. Like I said, they're a staff of like 5 or 6 people. So the fact that they put out a newspaper every week is just a miracle to me, and a testament to the dedication and hard work that they do. But I think that they also need a voice at the Dallas Morning News. And I know for a fact that they push for that. They push for the diversification of stories in the English-speaking product. And they push to have their stories from Spanish translated into English. But because of lack of resources or other decisions that are made, that doesn't always happen. So my plea to the Spanish-speaking audience is keep sending those emails to Al Dia and say, hey, we want to see this stuff in the Dallas Morning News. And our English-speaking folks as well. I know there's one state representative at least on this call. Keep talking to the Dallas Morning News and saying we want to see the stuff from Al Dia that's so doing such a good job at representing the Spanish-speaking population. We want to see that stuff in the English paper because they are part of us. So a lot of this is about engagement with Nicolas and Liz and Stacey Marie, and the engagement and meeting people where they're at. But we need you guys to sort of meet us where we're at, and we're in some old school ways. So we need you guys to bring us into this diversified Dallas County that we're now living in, and Texas.
Here in New York, we will, as I said, continue to go audience first. We serve in the Latino community still like a small population, a small group compared to the whole sample of like people that speak Spanish in this state. But at least this group of people that are highly engaged, that when we send a call out, they like, the other day we sent a call out, like asking them like how to like to send us like to either send an audio note, a voice note, or like fill a survey. And in like 2 days, we got like 60 people like engaging and talking to us about their lives, about like how they were doing in the pandemic, what made them happy, like in the small moments. So it's people that share their inner feelings with us. And I think that that's trust. So sometimes now we get people like, hey, I got this from like an aunt or my mom. Do you think it's fake? So we do a fake news like verification for them. I guess that when putting audiences first, that's like a very good remedy for like misinformation, because you build trust, because you're not giving people like a recipe from like you're just like parachuting yourself into a place and telling people like, hey, this is right and this is wrong, this is fake, this is the truth. Yep. You're actually a peer. I talk to my community like as Nico. I'm Nicolas, but like they call me Nico, and like they write to me with my nickname, and like that kind of like intimacy. We are going to do some like census, some fake news, some presidential like election stories from now on with this approach. And of course, like we will publish as much as we can. All the content that we do is basically journalism. We do report a lot. That's, and we hope to, we don't really know what's gonna be like after this year full of news, but hopefully it's gonna be something good.
Hopefully.
Say, yeah, please get registered to vote. If you have anyone in your family who isn't registered to vote, please reach out to me, Familia Vota. I'm gonna drop our hotline number in just a second, but yes, please, thank you so much for having us. But yeah, please get registered to vote, and yeah, we'll see you at the polls.
That's wonderful. Well, I want to thank our panelists. This was, I think, actually a really important conversation. And in beginning to bring people together, even hearing all of you talk about wanting to work together, wanting to share resources, bringing what often people say is somehow grassroots or community level discussions up to different levels and saying, this is important. And we have to elevate these issues because they are the fundamental fabric of our democracy. I think it is really critical. And in order to do that, we needed all of you. We needed you to say yes, because you are going to be responsible for the narratives and the way that they are crafted. And so I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility in thinking about our workshops, our work with communities and voters. And I see from all of you the kind of responsibility and integrity of thinking about the next 82 days. When election results are delayed and people don't know where to turn, I will point them to all of you because I know that you're going to be doing amazing coverage. So I want to thank our panelists. If we could do a sort of applause virtually, let's do that. No one gets applauded anymore. And you guys have been amazing. And then I want to thank so many, honestly, in typical Latino fashion, it took so many people to get this. And I just have to shout out everyone because our Dallas Public Library partners have been amazing. They put us in touch with Liz. My amazing partners from the Center for Community Media have been promoting this. Harkin has been promoting this. Election SOS team people, our First Draft friends, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, Funda Medios. It has been a massive team. And in order to get information today to all of you, we have had some wonderful translators here, which was the added cherry on top of everything. Because if we're really going to be doing this, I think we have to do what all of you have said in meeting people where they are. So, I like the light touch of being able to let our panelists speak, but honestly, with all the fervor ever, I want to just say we have to think about how we are meeting people. And the first step was bringing them Spanish and English tonight. So thank you to our interpreters. You have been amazing. One more round of applause for everyone.
Bravo.
Thank you all so much, and we will be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Yeah.
Yeah.